Good afternoon, everybody. This afternoon, we'll be hearing an update from Chief of Police Jim Raymer in regards to the 1984 homicide of Christine Jessop. Chief, please go ahead.
Okay. Thanks, Megan. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. Today, I am joined by Staff Superintendent Peter Coate from Detective Operations. He oversees the pillar that includes our homicide section and the officers responsible for investigating this case over the last 25 years. To provide an overview, it was October 3rd, 1984, when 9-year-old Christine Jessop went missing from her home in Queensville, Ontario, just north of Toronto and York Region. She was described as a girl who loved life, her family, school, and sports. Her face, as seen here today, was on every television set and every newspaper. Hundreds of community members assisted in searching for Christine. Tragically, on December 31st, 1984, Christine was found in Sunderland, Ontario, in Durham Region. She had been stabbed to death, and evidence that she had been sexually assaulted was located at the crime scene. The investigation, as we know, resulted in the arrest of Guy Paul Morin. He was acquitted at his first trial, found guilty of first-degree murder at his second trial, before a successful Crown appeal ultimately led to his acquittal in 1995 on fresh evidence that was submitted jointly by both the Crown and the defense. At that time, the fresh evidence was DNA that conclusively established Guy Paul Morin was not the donor of semen stains found on Christine Jessop's underwear. I am not here today to revisit that historical investigation. We are fortunate to have had the very thorough public inquiry and resulting recommendations from Justice Kaufman. I am here because of the diligent work of Toronto police investigators. On Friday, October 9th, 2020, we positively confirmed the identification of the person responsible for the DNA sample found on Christine's underwear. Calvin Hoover of Toronto, Ontario, was 28 years old in 1984. He was known to the Jessop family at the time of Christine's disappearance. He died in 2015. However, if he were alive today, the Toronto Police Service would arrest Calvin Hoover for the murder of Christine Jessop. Today's announcement is only the first very important answer in this ongoing investigation. It has obviously generated many more questions, and we are asking for the public's help as we look for information about Calvin Hoover in an effort to create a timeline of his whereabouts and the last moments of Christine's life. Please take a look at this photo. It is a photo of Mr. Hoover that dates back to the late 1990s. Despite how dated it is our hope that it may jog someone's memory about the events surrounding Christine's disappearance. If you have any information, no matter how insignificant it may seem, please contact police. Before I take questions, I want to acknowledge the family and friends of Christine Jessop. Our investigators met with Christine's mother this morning, and they continue to be with her at this moment. We have also met with Mr. Morin this morning and have shared this news with him. I believe there is no greater acknowledgement of his exoneration than the continued efforts of the Toronto Police Service to identify the person responsible for Christine's murder. Our investigators have also spoken to Justice Fred Kaufman. Because of the significant work he led during the public inquiry, we wanted to notify him personally of this development. Given the origins of this investigation, I have spoken with the chiefs of Durham and York Regional Police Services, as this case has had a profound impact on their respective members. There is nothing I can say today that can reverse the tragic events of 36 years ago. There are no winners in this announcement, and this is not a reason to celebrate. It does, however, allow us to take a major step forward in our efforts to bring justice to Christine's family. I thank the members of the Homicide Cold Case Section for their determination in getting us to this point. Thank you. And we'll take some questions if there are.
Thank you, Chief. We'll now take questions. The first one's from Mark Douglas at 680 News. Mark, please go ahead.
Thank you. Chief, can you tell us where did this new information come from? The Calvin Hoover, how was he identified? What lead came in? Was there a tip from the public? How did this come about?
We have identified him through DNA. But I think what I'll do is I'll turn it over to Staff Superintendent Peter Coe to maybe give you some background on how his name came, or how his DNA came to light.
Chief, thank you very much. In relation to Calvin Hoover, we've utilized an investigative technique that is fairly new in policing, certainly in Canada. It's been used, this technique has been used in the United States for the last couple of years, and just very recently within Toronto Police Service and other police services throughout our country. And it's genetic genealogy that we have actually used. Genetic genealogy is a very useful tool in murder investigations such as this one. We are not aware of any Canadian laboratories that specify or specialize in genetic genealogy, but we are aware that there are numerous labs in the United States that are available only to accredited law enforcement agencies. Simply put, it is not a DNA match. What it is it provides a potential, and I must stress a potential, family lineage from a DNA sample. Then it is up to a police investigator to build from that potential family lineage by conducting interviews, by going through historical records, by combing through numerous documents. And in doing so, in essence, builds out a family tree. I can tell you that, and from that family tree, then persons of interest may be identified. I can tell you that our perspective in this case is that genetic genealogy is not evidence. We are utilizing it as an investigative tool, as a technique that can give us a list of potential persons of interest. In this case, through our partnership with Center of Forensic Sciences, we were able to submit a sample of the semen stain that was located on Christine Jessop's underwear to a laboratory in the United States that is, again, only available to accredited law enforcement agencies. And it was the subsequent work by the Toronto Police Service homicide cold case investigators that were able to create two potential family trees after extensive combing through detailed reports and documents. The second family tree produced Calvin Hoover.
Mark, do you have a follow-up question?
Yes, I guess I still don't understand how this all actually began. Does Calvin, and I'm trying to understand if you mean literally a family tree here, has a Calvin Hoover relative committed a crime, or I guess I'm still not clear on how this new link to Calvin Hoover actually began.
So it's kind of in the reverse order. It's not that we start with Calvin Hoover. What we do is we start with a unidentified semen stain that has a DNA profile to it. This is submitted to a lab, and from that profile, they build out a potential familial lineage. And it's from that lineage that the investigators then work downwards to be able to try to identify potential persons of interest. The name Calvin Hoover is one of the names that came up in two specific families that we saw built out. The name Calvin Hoover, upon review of the investigative file, is a name that we know had a connection to the Jessop family.
Next question is from Patrick White at the Globe and Mail. Patrick, please go ahead.
Yeah, hi. You mentioned that the Jessop family had some knowledge of Mr. Hoover. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, he was an associate to the family. I think he and his wife had a neighbor acquaintance relationship with the family at the time in 1984, and I think Mrs. Hoover may have actually worked with Mr. Jessop at the time. I'm not sure specifically, but there was an acquaintance, and they did know each other, and were at the Jessop home as well.
Do you have a follow-up, Patrick?
Can you say anything more around the circumstances of his death?
What I will say is that he died in 2015, and there was no foul play associated with his death.
Next question goes to Lucas Meyer from News Talk 1010. Lucas, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. two questions. That clearly is a mugshot. I'm wondering if you can speak to what was Mr. Hoover's history, if it was, other cases of crimes against children, pedophilia, etc. What do we know about Hoover's history, even just looking at that shot?
He did have a dated criminal record, but it had no significance to this investigation.
And my other question that I had with regards to Mr. Hoover is obviously one of the big issues with this case was how it was handled. And I'm curious, based on this new evidence, was there any possibility that Mr. Hoover, either through the technology that was available before his death, or on if he was a potential suspect, for example, is there any way, either through investigation or through technology at the time, that he could have been previously identified, or was he a suspect at the time?
He was, what I can tell you, he was not a suspect at the time, but anything else would be pure speculation on my part, and I'm not prepared to comment on that.
Next question goes to Janella Massa at City TV. Janella, please go ahead. Janella? Okay, we'll come back to Janella. Next question from Brian Passafume from the Toronto Sun. Brian, please go ahead.
Good afternoon, everybody. Obviously, this is a case that a lot of men and women and a lot of police forces spent their lives and their careers tackling and agonizing over. I would never ask you to speak for anybody else, but tell me, there must be some sort of sense of relief having some.
I only ask questions here, you know. Oh.
Go ahead.
Hello?
Yeah, can you repeat that?
Sorry, could you repeat that, please, Brian?
Oh, yes, I'm sorry. This case consumed the lives and the careers of many men and women across a lot of police forces. I would never ask you to speak for anybody else, but there must be some sort of sense of relief, and that this has finally come to a close. That this case is has finally been solved. Can you speak about that? There must be some sort of glad that her killer was brought to justice.
From my perspective, I'm probably one of the few around that was still here when that murder was being investigated, and I can assure you that there is a great sense of relief, and it's not just in the policing profession. I mean, this has impacted the entire judiciary and the legal system in terms of prosecutors, defense counsel, judges, and everyone that have been involved in this process. And I think I'd be pretty safe to say that I think we are all genuinely relieved that the person actually responsible for this has finally been identified.
Brian, do you have a follow-up?
Oh, no further question. Thank you for the response.
Okay, Chief, I'm just going to read a question here from Janella Massa, who is just having some technical difficulties. She says, following up on Mark's question on the database of DNA, how is that compiled? Lots of people are using Ancestry.com and 23andMe type services. Are those mined for DNA?
Actually, Peter, perhaps you.
So thank you for the question. I can tell you I'm not an expert in this field, so I would not want to mislead anyone. I certainly know that the information that we are provided from a laboratory in the U.S. Is accredited for law enforcement use only. Again, it is not a scenario where they provide you with a match or a name of this is the donor of the DNA sample that you've provided. Instead, it is lineage that goes back in some cases decades, and quite often is very far removed from the actual donor of that actual sample that we've submitted in this case. In relation to what's happening with all of these different ancestry type databases and services that are available to the public, I'm not in a position to be able to comment one way or the other in relation to that.
And Megan, if I might, I just add that we worked very closely with the Ministry of the Attorney General, with Crown attorneys as well, and one who specialized in fact, in this area of expertise in terms of genealogy, and proceeded also with the judge's authorization to proceed. And so we worked very closely with them all along to arrive at this conclusion.
Janella's second question is, who is taking over the case now since it involves 3 police forces?
It will remain with the Toronto Police Service.
Okay. Next question goes to Steve Ryan from CP24. Steve, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Megan. Congratulations, Chief and Staff Superintendent. That's great work. It's been a long time coming. Can either of you maybe explain to those that don't understand? You didn't just pick this guy's name out of thin air, correct? There was something that led you in the direction of his identity, and then you gathered evidence that led you to your reasonable grounds. Is that a correct statement?
Yes, I mean, the initial review in terms of the genealogy and establishing the family tree was precisely that. It was the first step. What was interesting in that is going back and looking at the case files by the investigators, he was identified and was in the investigative file someone who had access to Ms. Jessop. So right away, we already knew that there was a great potential with this individual after his name was identified. And then subsequently, when we ran his DNA and it was compared, then we had the positive identification. So there was a number of steps in the process, but and again, it was just an excellent result.
And, sir, it does speak, I guess, to the work of the people at the Center of Forensic Sciences, and it does give the hope to those who are waiting for that phone call saying that we did identify the person that killed your loved one. I mean, it does give a lot of people an incredible hope. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, science is progressing exponentially, and there's new developments all the time. And we in law enforcement, all of us in law enforcement, will maximize the benefits that we can obtain by utilizing all of these scientific techniques as they come along. And it, when we talk about a cold case and the value of a cold case unit, we're just not going to give up, and somebody is always going to be looking.
Next question goes to Alicia Hasham at the Toronto Star. Alicia, please go ahead.
Hi, yeah. So how did the DNA come to be sent to the lab as you described? Is that sort of standard procedure for cold cases? Was it done in some sort of order? How many, and is it standard procedure, and how many cases is this happening with in the cold case unit?
What I can tell you in terms of this investigation, over the course of, I think in approximately 1996 that it was assigned to the Toronto Police, we have submitted over 300 samples, bodily samples, to the Center of Forensic Sciences for purposes of furthering this investigation. It was the new process of examining this genealogy, which is something that we just started looking at in the last year, and as Peter had mentioned, has really met some success for the last couple of years in the United States. So that just started the process for us. It was just another investigative tool that we utilized, and then ultimately we had samples. The Center for Forensic Science had samples available of Mr. Hoover's blood, and they were able to make the match because it was in their possession.
Alicia, do you have a follow-up?
Yeah, so you also mentioned you were asking the public to come forward with any information they might have about the timeline. I was wondering if you have any specific questions you're seeking to have answered, and if at the conclusion of the investigation, if there will be a report sort of outlining this, since obviously there won't be a trial.
That's correct, but we're actually interested in learning a lot about Mr. Hoover over his lifetime from 1994 until his death in 2015. We'd like to know, quite frankly, what he was doing, and to see if there's anything out there that somebody can help us with or point us to, or even look, is there something else that he potentially could have been involved in the intervening years from 1984 to 2015. So there's still much work to be done.
We have a follow-up.
And just, will there be a report issued sort of at the end, kind of outlining all of the information that comes from this investigation?
There won't be a public report we do record everything that we are as part of the report of investigation that we record, but like I say, it's still ongoing, and if we develop more information, we will advise the public accordingly.
Next question is back to Mark Douglas at 680 News. Mark, go ahead, please.
Thank you, Jennifer. So just to make sure I fully understand the genetic genealogy system here, Hoover's, the DNA sample is taken from the evidence, sent to the lab in the U.S. that's applying this technique, and then you eventually wind up with Hoover's name. Is Hoover's DNA or his blood not on file from any other previous crime? Was this genetic genealogy the only way that you could identify him? Could you not just take the DNA, run it through a regular DNA test or a current DNA technology test, and come up with his name?
No, we could not. I mean, the Center for Forensic Science has a database of samples that are submitted. In some cases, they're known. Some cases, they are unknown. And what we submitted was an unknown sample to be traced, the original sample that was on Christine Jessop's underwear. That was through that sample, running it through the genealogy process, we were able to establish and identify, after establishing the family tree, to identify Mr. Jessop, or Mr. Hoover, I'm sorry. And then the Center of Forensic Science coincidentally had a bodily sample from Mr. Hoover in their possession. So now we provided the sample in their possession was compared to the sample from Christine Jessop's underwear, and the two of them matched.
Okay. And then if I may, with follow-up, do you think this genetic genealogy technique can be applied to any other current homicide investigations or any other high-profile cold cases?
We are actually looking at that and using this as a possibility where we think it might be a viable option for us.
Thank you.
Unless there are any follow-up questions, that will be the end of our news conference. A copy of Chief Raymer's remarks and the photos that are up on the television screen will be available through a news release. Any other follow-up questions can be directed to corporate communications. Thank you very much. That concludes this afternoon's news conference.